the studio recording industry has changed rather a lot since I landed my first job. I mean, this is long before the internet, so it was quite hard to find out about jobs. They weren't really advertised. Even in those days, it was legendarily hard to get into the studio business. So I actually just, from going to the library and getting books out about recording and that sort of thing, I started writing letters to studios. And then the same week, I went to see Livingston Studios, and I got interviewed by Jerry Boys, who's he's a bit of a legend. He was the studio manager. He worked on Lady Madonna, and the Beatles were recording that. So when they offered me the job, of course, I leapt at the chance to earn £1.25 an hour. After I'd been there only a few months, they bought an SSL desk, Solid State Logic, which was quite a major upgrade for them. They were kind of revolutionary in those days. And interestingly, that desk is still there in Livingston Studios. That many years later, it's still thought of as a good desk to use. When I first started at Livingston, I thought I would work my way up, make the tea for a bit, and then hopefully get promoted and become house engineer. There were 2 studios at Livingston, and as I say, that kind of gradually disappeared through the late 80s, that everyone started going freelance. The Smiths came in, and the song they recorded was Panic. I don't know if anybody remembers it. It's the one that goes, hang the DJ, hang the DJ, hang the DJ. So gradually, I did actually work my way up to a point where I was starting to engineer sessions at Livingston, and I did some very strange ones to start with, but I was very lucky and landed the job of working with Coldcut. And that was quite a light bulb moment, because up to that point, everybody who turned up at Livingston was either a producer, an engineer, or a musician, or a vocalist. It was interesting working with Coldcut, because they sort of were self-admittedly sort of fairly green in the studio, so it was like the blind leading the blind, really. You know, I was trying to find out what all the compressors and EQs did, and they were trying to work their computer and find bits of records and put things together. And I got a phone call on a Friday afternoon to the effect of, would you do the programming for this session as well? Somebody started doing a bit of programming in software called Steinberg Pro 24, which was the forerunner to Cubase on the Atari. And would you do the programming? I said, yeah, of course. Having never touched a computer before. And I'd only ever watched Coldcut, and they had Notator, which was kind of the rival system. So I had no clue as to what Steinberg Pro 24 even was particularly. I'd sort of heard of it. But it became a useful skill to have. I turned up on a Monday and got it all set up very excitedly, plugged it all in, and it all worked. I got away with it somehow. You know, the thing is to have confidence in those sort of situations. If you're thrown into a situation, you know, if somebody asks you, can you do something, usually the best answer is yes. I think if you're in a career improving moment, I think that's probably the best advice. Say yes and then worry about it later. I remember when I turned up at Livingston, and I'd read a few books out of the library on tape and recording and things like this, and asking one of the Livingston engineers, I said, well, what tape biasing, what's that all about? You know, he said, oh, don't worry about it. Nobody understands how that really works, the science behind it. I went to Ocean Colours Scene Studio in Birmingham to work with Primal Scream. I'll play you a bit of the best known track that I worked on there was Kowalski.
This radio station was named Kowalski in honor of the last American hero to whom speed means freedom of the soul.
So everything you hear going on was done live, effectively. So we were kind of playing the mixing desk like an instrument. And things like this, which is a Maestro Echoplex tape delay. And the bit in the middle there is a slider to set the delay setting. So we would be throwing things at the delay and then fiddling about with that to get all that kind of pitch changing, feeding back and weird stuff going on. And you can hear things panning around, and that would be one of us on the desk twiddling the knob backwards and forwards and panning it around. So some of the edits, really mad things happen, you know, because which just you wouldn't do these days if you're mixing in Pro Tools, because you tend to set things up and leave them where they are. So another freelancing job I did was I was starting to produce by this point, as well as just engineer sessions. I produced this. What happened was I went freelance. I left Livingston, having had a bit of success with the Soup Dragons. Jerry, the boss at Livingston, said, I think you ought to go freelance now. And I went off to this amazing studio in Belgium called Galaxy Studios. But they had this Neve Capricorn desk, which was one of the first sort of mainstream digital desks. And I absolutely hated it. It was the most annoying to use thing because it had loads of little grey buttons that you couldn't really tell what they all did unless you really stared at them very hard. And then the computer system was very inconsistent from screen to screen. It did really take some learning. They got it a bit better later on, but it was quite a new thing, and the computer would crash. And because it was all digital, the band would be out in the studio. I was working with a rock band from Amsterdam, and they'd be out in the studio playing away, and the computer would crash, and then I couldn't even talk to them because the talkback was part of the digital systems. So they'd be going... I mean, I can't. So I'd have to... And because of all these great big thick bits of glass, it was the most enormous place, so it'd be a sort of 2-minute walk to go out there and say, sorry guys, the computer's crashed, and then spend 10 minutes trying to reboot it and make it all work again. But it was a very useful session to learn how to use the Neve Capricorn, because suddenly, when I came back to the UK, the word got around somehow that I knew how to use these things. And one person who owned one in the UK was Mike Oldfield. He was a bit of a genius as well at sort of, again, playing the mixing desk like a musical instrument. He'd sort of sit at the mixing desk with in his kind of lotus position, cross-legged on the chair, and just be dancing around, pressing buttons and doing stuff and kind of just making it work, really, and not getting too obsessed with the technology. It's very easy in the world of studios and technology and Sound on Sound magazine to get obsessed with all these things that don't really matter too much. People obsess over mic preamps these days quite a lot, and when I first started working at Livingston and using the SSL desk, nobody gave a thought really to mic preamps particularly on most of the sessions I was working on. The mic preamp was just what was the mic gain? It was the knob at the top of the desk on the channel. You didn't really think about what it sounded like particularly. You know, Jerry's philosophy was just to use the best gear possible. You know, his quote, I remember him saying to you, it just makes you look good. If you use good gear and it kind of sounds good, it makes you look like you're a good engineer. So another career move I made was journalism. And then gradually I started to do interviews with people as well, which has been a source of information, really, because I get to go and ask other producers what they do and find out what techniques they use. So I combine we go and interview these people. Mike takes the photos, which get used by the magazine, videos it, puts it on his website. I record the audio of our conversation and type it all into the computer and edit it a bit and submit it and get paid for doing it. So that's been a nice little regular earner. You know, it's not huge amounts of money, but it can fill in the gaps, really. And, you know, when I first started at Livingston, I thought my career path was going to be, I was going to be the house engineer and I was going to be employed, and, you know, if I was very lucky, I might be a producer at some point, but I thought I was going to be, that was going to be my PAYE, a pension plan, be a house engineer. But the industry has changed very rapidly, really, and you kind of have to be on your toes all the time and open to any of these sort of opportunities that arise. Production music. I was very lucky to get a track that was last year used on the ITV Champions League Weekly programme, and so it was on the telly every Sunday night on ITV. You know, I was lucky enough to get sent a brief for this with a very short notice. Kind of, we need this by next Friday. They need music for the next season of Champions League. Have a listen to what they used last year. It's got to be exciting, but not that exciting. So it's kind of music it's beaty and it's sort of quite groovy, but there's no great melodies going on or anything kind of that takes your ear away from the interview with David Beckham that's going on over the top of it. Yes, sir.
Can you give any tips on setting up your own bedroom studio in terms of the acoustics?
Yeah, I worked in my bedroom before I built my studio. I did start working in a sort of spare bedroom, and there was no acoustic. I mean, it was so full of junk that we wouldn't be any room for acoustic treatment. It was full of Fender Rhodes pianos and mixing desk and speakers everywhere and chaos. But the thing is to also listen to records you like and find out what they sound like in your room, and do lots of A-Bing and comparing, because that's the only way to really tell. Because your ear quickly adjusts to how bright or dull things are.
Yes, I'm wondering, what do you think the tendencies are now in terms of the fidelity that people are getting the music in?
It is a consideration when you're making music, obviously. Very often, towards the final stages of a mix, I'll have at least one listen through on a pair of headphones, because I know that people are going to obviously hear it on an iPod at some point. And that's important to make sure it sounds reasonably good on an iPod. So, I mean, I don't listen on earbuds, but I listen on some, you know, mid-range, reasonably good studio headphones, and I'll usually pick up on something during that listen through that leaps out at me or that strikes me as not being quite right. And at the top of the list has to be things like whether the music's any good in the first place, or whether somebody can sing, or how good the song is, or whether the guitar's in tune, and all those other kind of much more important things, really.